until the philosophy which hold one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned. That until there's no longer first class and second class citizens of any nation, until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, that until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all without regard to race. This is an excerpt from Haile Selassie's address to the UN, 1963, October 4th, adopted by Bob Marley's song, War. My name is Alaric Simon. This is FIS 201. This is my plan for the Systemic Racism Innovation Intervention. Systemic Racism in Education. Hawthorne is a city located in Los Angeles County, California. Hawthorne, California, population 2023, worldpopulationreview.com. Like many other communities in the United States, Hawthorne has a history of racism and discrimination against Black people and other people of color. During the early 20th century, Hawthorne was known as a sundown town, meaning that it had a policy of excluding Black people and other minorities from living in the city. Sundown towns were so named because they had an unwritten rule that people of color were not allowed to be within city limits after dark, and those who violated this rule risked being harassed, arrested, or even violently attacked. Hawthorne's reputation as a sundown town persisted well into the 20th century. In the 1940s and 1950s, the city became a hub of aerospace manufacturing, and many white workers moved to Hawthorne to work in the industry. Meanwhile, Black workers were excluded from these jobs and were often unable to find housing in Hawthorne or nearby communities due to discrimination and racist housing policies. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement brought increased attention to the issue of racial discrimination in housing and employment, and activities began to challenge the racist policies that had excluded Black people and other minorities from communities like Hawthorne. However, the legacy of racism and discrimination in Hawthorne and other communities continues to have an impact on the lives of people of color in this day. In recent years, community activities or community activists and organizations have worked to address issues of racial justice in Hawthorne and other communities in the Los Angeles area, advocating for policies and practices that promote equity and inclusion for all residents. I believe that being active in the local community organizations, providing ways to educate the community in the most effective way to further growth in overcoming those continued practices. Education is crucial in addressing systemic racism. It is essential to educate the community on the history of racism, the impact of racism on communities of color, and how it manifests in our daily lives. Addressing systemic racism in education requires a multifaceted approach that includes both structural changes and innovative interventions. Here are examples of innovative interventions that could be considered. 1. Diversifying the curriculum. One innovative intervention is to incorporate a more diverse curriculum that reflects the history and experiences of marginalized communities. This could involve adding materials and resources that highlight the combination and experiences of underrepresented groups in history, literature, science, and other subjects. Number 2, culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching involves taking into account the cultural backgrounds, experiences, and learning styles of students in the classroom. This approach can help to create a more inclusive and supportive learning environment for students of all backgrounds. Number 3, teacher training. Providing professional development and training for teachers on topics related to equity, diversity, and inclusion can help to create a more informed and culturally competent teaching workforce. Number 4, mentoring and role models. Connecting students with mentors and the role models from diverse backgrounds can help to inspire and motivate students, especially those who may feel marginalized or disconnected from the school community. Number 5, parent and community engagement. Engaging parents and community members in the education process can help to build stronger relationships between schools and the community. This can involve creating opportunities for parents and community members to be involved in social and school activities and decision-making processes. Number 6, digital learning. Incorporating digital learning tools and resources can help to provide greater access to educational materials for students from diverse backgrounds who may not have access to traditional resources. These are just a few examples of innovative interventions that could be considered to address systemic racism in education. It is important to note that no single intervention is a silver bullet, and a comprehensive approach that addresses multiple aspects of systemic racism in education is needed. The perception of these models of intervention can vary among different groups, depending on their individual beliefs, experiences, and values. Here are some examples of how different groups might perceive these interventions. Number 1, marginalized communities who have historically been impacted by systemic racism may be more likely to view these interventions positively. They may see these interventions as steps towards creating a more inclusive and equitable educational system that recognizes and values their experiences and contributions. Number 2, advocacy groups that focus on issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion may also view these interventions positively. They may see them as critical steps towards addressing the structural and institutional barriers that have contributed to systemic racism in education. Number 3, opponents of equity and inclusion may view their intervention as threats to the existing education system and may argue that they promote political correctness or receive discrimination. Number 4, traditionalists are some people who have a more traditional view of education, may view these interventions as unnecessary or even harmful. They may agree that incorporating more diverse curriculum, for example, take away from the traditional educational goals of teaching core academic subjects. Number 5, teachers and administrators may view these interventions differently depending on their own personal experiences and beliefs. Some may embrace these interventions as important steps towards creating a more inclusive and supportive learning environment, while others may be more resistant to change and see them as burdensome or unnecessary. It is important to note that there is no monolithic group that holds a single perspective on these interventions. It is important to engage in ongoing dialogue with a range of stakeholders to understand their perspectives and work collaboratively towards creating a more inclusive, real, equitable educational system. In order to make a difference and create lasting change, the observed innovative interventions for addressing systemic racism must be implemented in a way that is sustained over time and embedded in the educational system. Here are some ways in which these interventions can be used to change the point of view for the future on a deeper level. Normalizing inclusive practices. Number 1, by consistently integrating more diverse and inclusive practices into the educational system, these practices can become the norm rather than the exception. This can help to create a culture of inclusivity that is embraced by educators, students, and the broader community. Number 2, building empathy and understanding by incorporating materials and resources that highlight the experiences and perspective of marginalized communities. Students can develop a greater sense of equity or empathy and understanding towards people from different backgrounds. This can help to break down stereotypes and prejudices and promote a more inclusive and tolerant society. Number 3, empowering marginalized communities. By giving voice and visibility to marginalized communities, innovative interventions can help to empower these communities and promote a sense of agency and empowerment. This can help to create a more equitable and just society where all individuals are able to participate full and equally. Number 4, fostering critical thinking and analysis by incorporating more diverse perspective and materials. Innovative interventions can help to foster critical thinking and analysis among students. This can help students to better understand the historical and social context of systems, racism, and develop the skills to analyze the challenge systems of oppression. Number 5, creating long-term change by embedding innovative interventions into the educational system. These interventions can have a lasting impact that extends beyond the current generation of students. The CAP, this can help to create a future with systemic racism, where systemic racism is no longer accepted or tolerated, and where all individuals are able to participate fully and equally in society. Overall, making a difference and changing the point of view for the future on a direct level requires a sustained and comprehensive approach that addresses multiple aspects of systemic racism in education. By embedding innovative interventions into the educational system, we can create a more inclusive and equitable future for all individuals. A good strategy from a grassroots perspective for implementing an innovative intervention to address systemic racism in education would involve the following steps. Community organizing. The first step would be to build a coalition of individuals and organizations who are committed to promoting equity and inclusion in education. This could involve reading out to local advocacy groups, faith-based organizations, parent-teacher associations, and other community groups. Number 2, identify the issue. The next step would be to identify a specific issue or area of focus the grassroots organization wants to address. For example, this could involve advocating for the inclusion of more diverse curriculum, addressing racial disparities in discipline, or increasing cultural diversity. Number 3, develop a plan. Once this issue has been identified, the grassroots organization should develop a plan, a detailed plan for how they will address it. This could involve conducting research on best practices, engaging with stakeholders to build support, and developing a strategy for how to implement the intervention. Number 4, build support. The next step would be to build support for the intervention among key stakeholders, including educators, parents, students, and policymakers. This would involve holding community meetings, hosting informational sessions, and building relationships with key decision makers. Implementation. Once there is enough support for the intervention, the grassroots organization should begin to implement it. This could make piloting the intervention in a single school or classroom and evaluating its effectiveness. If it is successful, the intervention can be scaled up to reach more students in schools. Number 6, evaluation and improvement. Finally, it is important to continually evaluate and improve the intervention to those that Yeah. That is okay, it said, finally, it is important to continually evaluate and improve the interventions to ensure that it is having the intended impact. This should involve collecting data on student outcomes, soliciting them from stakeholders, and making adjustments as necessary. In summary, a grassroots strategy for implementing an innovative intervention to address systemic racism in education involves building a coalition of stakeholders, identifying an issue, developing a plan, building support, implementing, and continually evaluating and improving it. By following these steps, grassroots organizations can bring their innovative ideals to life and create long-lasting change in the education system. Thank you.